Last week, Bridget opened her remarks by commenting on the difficulty which Mary Magdalene had in recognising the resurrected Jesus and the difficulty that Thomas had believing in it. Today I'd like to explore further this difficulty, which was shared by many of Jesus' closest friends and colleagues, including Cleopas and his anonymous companion on this walk to the village of Emmaus, which lies west of Jerusalem, about halfway towards the Mediterranean coast. Little more than 48 hours after Jesus' execution, his friends are, of course, still in shock about his death. And they're also in denial, both about whom really Jesus is and about what's just happened. The two men describe Jesus not as the Son of God, but as a prophet whom we'd hoped was going to redeem Israel. And they disbelieve the testimony of Mary and the other women who just that morning had discovered the empty tomb and met angels there. Shock and denial, two very human reactions, but ones which can slow us down in a crisis from seeing the truth. So Cleopas and his friend fail to recognise the man who walks with them, just as Mary had not recognised the man whom she'd taken to be the gardener, and just as, much later on when they're back in Galilee out fishing, Peter, John and the other disciples fail to recognise the man building a fire by the lakeside. No wonder perhaps that Jesus calls out these two men on their walk for their foolishness and slowness of heart. But I must admit to a lot of sympathy for them. I'd be just as battered and dazed as they were. I also rather admire their courage in later telling the story and Jesus' forthright comments about them against themselves. These are among the details which to me give this story the authenticity of an eyewitness account. The story also illustrates that the person they meet is not only the resurrected man, Jesus, but also the eternal, omnipotent, and universal Christ, who, as Peter writes in today's epistle, was chosen before the creation of the world. That the Christ has extraordinary non-human attributes is shown in the days after the resurrection. He appears and disappears at will to his disciples, passing through locked doors if needs be. He gathers a host of fish on the other side of Peter's boat for the disciples to catch and haul in. And later he appears as a light and a voice to Saul on the road to Damascus. Of course, Saul never met Jesus the man. In the Gospel, Jesus goes on to point out to the two travellers that the Christ had to suffer these things and explain to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. But although their hearts burned within them as the Christ spoke with them, Cleopas and his mate still didn't recognise their companion until he gave thanks, broke bread, and began to give it to them. So what brings recognition, recognition, literally again knowing, to these two men and to the others at different times? It's an encounter with the presence of not just the resurrected man, Jesus of Nazareth, but also of the universal, omnipotent Christ. An encounter and experience which moves them beyond belief to certainty. And the same is true for us. The Franciscan priest Richard Rohr writes that, like Mary Magdalene, we must somehow hear our name pronounced, must hear ourselves being addressed and regarded by love, before we can recognise the Christ in our midst. And like Mary, we usually need to start with the concrete encounter before we move to the universal experience available to all. That's certainly been true for me. My experience far outstrips my theology, so I can only describe what I've experienced, most especially in the nearly 5 years now since my wife's sudden and unexpected death. First, that whatever else God may be, God is certainly a God of mercy and mercies. That's no longer a hope or even a belief, but an experience, and so a certainty. Second, that suffering and love and letting go and blessings somehow mysteriously work together and come together to heal. And so between them, these two characteristics reveal both God's loving acceptance of me as I am, warts and all, and also the wonderful possibility of change, growth, and new life through God's love. I'm not special or better or more deserving than anyone else. Jesus the Christ loves me neither more or less than he loves anyone else. So what is true for me, what I've experienced, must therefore be equally true and equally available for everybody else, for all humanity. Christ is not an escape plan from a condemned world for a chosen few. Rather, as Bridget described last week, Christ is the wonderfully hopeful symbol of the universal pattern that new life always follows death.